Hey, what's up? I'm Jason, and today we're going to talk about working on AAA games as a tools programmer. If you haven't already seen my video about working on AAA games in the QA department, which is where I started, I'd go check that out first. But if you're not interested or you already saw it, then just hit the like and share buttons, and we'll get on to talking about tools development. Again, if you share it, it really helps a lot. If you like it, it helps a bit. And if you have questions, please just drop them down below and I'll try to reply. And also, if you have experience working on tools and games, I'd be kind of curious to know how your experience was different or the same, or I don't know, whatever you got to share. Kind of curious. It's always nice to talk to other people about this stuff. So let's get going with tools development. I mentioned in the previous video that my QA department stint lasted about 3 weeks before I got laid off. And then I got the call and the offer. It was about 6 weeks after that to come down and work on tools for the Vanguard team. That's this game that's hidden behind my lamp. So it was to build tools for an MMO because a lot of the tools developers had kind of disappeared in the layoffs that happened right before that. So I was working at the company in QA. They got bought. They had some layoffs. Some stuff got rearranged. And the people who were building the designers' tools at the time left as well. I don't remember if they got laid off or they just happened to leave right around that time, or they saw all the stuff going on and decided they wanted to go somewhere else. So they needed to rebuild that tools team. They needed somebody to come in and start creating tools, modifying and updating the existing tools and all that. And it wasn't going to be in the QA department anymore because we'd been bought by Sony, or whatever the deal was that got worked out. Sony was now dealing with the QA and the testing. So it wasn't going to be underneath that. It was going to be on the actual dev team, just building up these tools. So I get in there and, well, the interview process was pretty straightforward and simple. It was another quick phone interview, and I flew down before that too. So I flew down for a quick interview just to talk more to the programming team. I think it was going to be pretty easy to get in. They already met me and kind of liked me and had a feeling I could do the job, which luckily they guessed right. I don't know that I would have passed a really in-depth, intense interview at the time, but I was passionate about it and excited and ready to learn. So they let me in and I started the job. Like I said, it flew down like 6 weeks after I'd been laid off. So I get in there, and day one, I remember getting set up with a computer. We're putting it under my little desk at my cube area, getting everything installed, trying to download. So I had to set up Perforce, which was our source control system, and then download the project, which was relatively huge at the time. I don't remember the size, but it was like 20 or 30 gigs on a probably 100 megabit. Maybe it was gigabit back then, but I think it might have been 100 megabit network that I was using. So it was nice and slow and took like a full day. But while that's running, we had these meetings going on. So with the Vanguard team, we had these daily stand-up meetings at, I think it was like 11 in the morning. So I'd get in there around 9 or 10, because most of the people that worked there tended to work later. So they'd get in around 9, 10 in the morning and then work until like 7, 8, some of them way later. A couple people got in early, but most of us tended to work these later hours. I think it was primarily to avoid traffic and because everybody was game players who were up all night playing games when they got home from work, right? So anyway, we go to this meeting and everybody's going around listing off all of the things that they're doing. And this was a really big meeting. There were, God, I don't know, 20 people in this stand-up at the time. I think eventually they kind of got shrunk and fixed, but at the time when it kicked off, the meetings were really huge. So there's a lot of people going around talking about all this crazy stuff that they're working on, all these new gameplay systems, these bugs that they're fixing, these optimizations that they're making to rendering stuff. And I'm just standing there like, I don't know what 90% of these words mean. I don't know what you guys are talking about, but I'm just going to stand here silent. Just totally intimidated and overwhelmed at first. So that went on until they got to me, right? They go around and they're like, well, what are you doing? I'm like, setting up a computer? And they're like, okay, well, we've got a thing that we want you to do. And I was like, you do? Like, what do you mean? What's the thing? And the thing they wanted me to do was build a system, design and build a system that would allow the design team to push data from their sandbox development environment to the environment that was going to go out to our test server and then eventually to the production server. So at the time, the process was ridiculous. They would actually go in and they would build all of this stuff. Like, so say they're populating a zone or they're creating some items. They would build all of these things in this local environment, right? So they'd set up their tool. They'd say, hey, point to the, I forget what it was called. It was like internal or sandbox. I think it was called sandbox. They would point their tool to the sandbox database. They would go in, they would create all of the stuff. They would log into the local server. When I say local, it wasn't a local server. It was just like an internal dev server. And there were, I think, 2 of them. So they'd log into this sandbox server. They'd go in and check to make sure all of their stuff looked good. And then they would have somebody check it, like their lead for their design department, because the design department was split up into multiple little teams handling all of the different areas and disciplines. Like, there would be a team that handles like this area of this continent. There's a lot of designers, right? The team was huge. So they'd get it all checked off, get it approved, and then they would switch their tool over to go against the development database and do it all again. So they would literally just repeat the process and recreate everything. As you can imagine, like, as an experienced game developer, you're gonna say, hey, that seems bad, right? That's going to cause problems, because if you redo the work, like, how do you know you didn't screw it up the second time? Like, you may have come up with an idea that looks okay and it works fine, and then easily just broken it when you're re-implementing it the second time. This was happening relatively regularly, which is why they wanted to change the process and build a tool around it. Plus, it was just a giant waste of designer time. Imagine you go in and you create all this content, and then you go, okay, I'm done. Now I got to do it all again. Right, and hope I don't screw it up, and then go through testing it again. So I had no idea how to do this, right? They said this, and I thought, okay, I'm in the wrong job. I should probably quit now and have somebody else do this that has some idea what the hell they're talking about, because I had no clue how anything like this would work. Luckily, we're in this big stand-up meeting, and a couple of the guys, and they're like, hey, so here's some ideas for how I think I would do it. I remember Steve was the best at this. He would just start spitballing ideas on how he thought maybe it should work. And like perhaps the designers could flag things or tag things, and then another tool to just push stuff over and copy the data that they flagged as ready to copy over or something like that. And he also recommended, hey, go talk to our DBA, because he's really helpful. Is Mike, who was a great guy too, super helpful and taught me almost everything I know about databases. He's a really awesome guy. But anyway, he's like, yeah, go talk to Mike. And then when you have problems and questions, come talk to me. And a couple other guys on the team were the same way. They're very helpful and just kind of ready to help kind of guide a noob who had no clue what he was doing through this process. So I built the tool, and it took, I think, a couple weeks. So it was like maybe 3, maybe even 4 weeks to get this whole thing up and running. It was a totally separate tool that would push data from one database to another, but it also involved learning how the design data tool worked. So there was a tool for designers to go in and create NPCs, to create abilities, to create items or quests or whatever. And that tool I had to hook into as well. I had to set up something to say, hey, I'm working on this. I think we called them branches at the time. So they'd set a branch, and whenever you would save records, it would essentially just add in, every table had a column there, and it would just add a little entry for what branch ID it was in. So then you could push everything from all the tables that matched that ID. So, game designer, like my buddy Salim, he'd be working on something for crafting, and he'd make a crafting branch, and he'd go in and save all of his things, he'd work in it for however long. And then when he was like, okay, all the crafting stuff is good, we'd come over, we'd push the button, and it would copy the data over. This was a great learning experience for me. It was a terrifying experience for me, because I thought for sure I was going to screw it up and totally fail. But it taught me a lot about not just how the game worked and how to work with databases, but also how to start thinking of ideas on how to build tools from scratch and how to build different systems from scratch that might come in useful and save us time. So, I mean, a lot of the time, I think when you start off as a developer, it's easy to jump into existing tools and know how, kind of figure out how they work. I say easy, but it's easier to start by doing that and going into existing things, figuring out how they work and making little changes. Coming up with and building new tools on your own and building the right thing is extremely hard. And I mean, as much as I don't like the code that was in that thing, when I think back to what that code looked like and just how terrible it was, the actual process and the workflow worked really well. I mean, it met all of the requirements. It was really, really simple and caused very few problems. There were occasional little issues here and there, but overall it just kind of worked, and it was simple and yeah, good stuff. So from that, that was literally, I'd say, my first month or so working on tools development, which was probably not the normal, right? I would guess that the normal is more like you come in, it's more like when I worked on tools for EQ2, where I came in, looked at the existing tools, and made a bunch of fixes and changes that were requested at first. I'll talk about that in another video, though, when I switched over to working on EQ2 in the process there. But after that month, it wasn't so much just working on that tool. Instead, it was back to working on the existing design tools. And the way that that process worked was, it was very different from working on regular game development stuff. So a lot of the time when you're working on regular game development, like you're doing gameplay stuff, or you're doing graphic stuff, or just building the game, right? You'll have these meetings with the code department. You'll figure out what the priorities are. The lead will say, hey, here's the things that need to be done. Go do those. Like here's who's doing what, and you kind of go off and do those things. For the tool stuff, it was a bit different because at the time I was the only one doing tool stuff, and programming didn't care too much about it, to be honest. I mean, they cared when it came to the pushing data tool. After that, the interest in what stuff was going on with tools was very, very low from the engineering side. And that's because the engineering side doesn't use the tools, right? Like programmers just don't use the tools. They don't see them. They don't interact with them. And they were all C++ programmers who didn't really care about this stupid C# tool that the designers use. I mean, I say that kind of lightly because obviously they cared about it, and some of them did put in work on it. But overall, they were much more concerned with the game, getting the game working right, getting the issues that were important to players fixed, not so much working on making designers' lives easier. And when you're a tools developer, your whole job is to make the designer's life easier. It's to make it easier for the game designers to build the game that you want them to build. Or sometimes it's also to make it easier for the artists to build the game that you want to build. But a lot of the time, I'd say the brunt of the work comes down to building stuff for the designers, especially when it comes to an MMO, because there's so much content that's going in. The tooling pipeline for that needs to be as smooth and easy to use and fast as possible. You don't want designers to have to do a whole bunch of crazy work going in and editing a bunch of files or figuring things out or knowing stuff, like memorizing what goes in column FF, which I'll talk about that some other time, right? Using big access databases and Excel for content stuff. It works, but it turns into a nightmare quick. Anyway, so your whole job is really just working with the designers. So my priorities would usually come from the game design team. It'd be the lead designer and some of the other more senior designers coming up with things that are slowing them down, things that make their job harder, things that we could do to simplify their workflow and speed it up. And they would just constantly come in with new stuff, and I would run it by the lead programmer real quick, say, hey, this is what they want to change. Any objections? And usually be like, nope, go for it. Go do the thing that they want to do. And I would just work on those things. And that was almost like every day. So I spent a lot of time hanging out with and talking to the game designers, watching them go through the flow of building things and fixing that flow. I also wanted to just mention, though, when you're doing this design or working with these designers, or I'd say it's the same with working with any end user in software, you really need to watch them use your tools. So you're building these tools up and you're used to using them, right? You get used to the shortcuts that you've made, the hotkeys, you know all of it because you built the damn thing. Like you should know how everything works, right? And it just kind of becomes innate knowledge. When you let other people use it, you'll find that they do all kinds of weird, crazy things that you wouldn't have thought about, or they don't remember the one little time that you told them, oh yeah, just hit this key and it's faster and it'll do the thing that you want. And they'll do things the slow way. So a lot of the time what I would do is watch the game designers in action. So just sit with them, be like, hey, I'm just going to, okay if I just hang out and just watch you work for like an hour or two, just watch the process and see what you're doing. And they almost never objected. In fact, I don't know if anybody ever objected because they knew that the whole benefit here, the whole reason was so that I could make their stuff even better and easier to use. And while they're using it, I'd watch them just clicking away and typing and moving their mouse around, all that stuff. And they would just talk, right? They'd be telling me like, oh yeah, this thing's really annoying. This thing's slow. I gotta click it and I gotta wait. And they'd be like, oh yeah, I need to go hook this one thing up, but I gotta do it in 5 different places to hook up these relationships. And I'd find all kinds of little issues and little things that I could fix and improve for them, which I think made a big difference in their workflow time, but also just made a big impression on them. So when it came time to do other things, like when you're a tools developer, let's be honest, the designers tend to love you because you're just building things that make their life awesome. And I don't even know what else to say about it, really. Like, that was pretty much everything I did, right? I would just go in, I would talk to designers. They would say, hey, can you make this faster? Can you change this? Can you add this? Why can't I see this one weird thing? Like there's a setting that I can't change and I don't know why. I would go, okay, well, let me check it out and figure it out and fix it. And that was the job, right? Just go in and build things to make it easier. Now, when it came to building other new tools, I'm going to talk more about that when I talk about working on EverQuest 2 tools, because there was a lot of interesting stuff that I got to do on that side, just coming up with new ways to streamline and speed things up. I'll talk about that one later, though. Just for now, we'll stick to Vanguard. It's, again, mostly just building cool database tools, building pushing tools, and writing simple C# code. So for anybody who's confused on what I was working in, by the way, or because I didn't even talk about it, right? Just skipped right past that. So what was I working in? Visual Studio, and at the time, WinForms. So it was Visual Studio and WinForms Visual Studio, WinForms in Visual Studio. Were probably the way I should have said it, right? So just building these Windows tools that interact with a Microsoft SQL Server database, and pop up little windows and show data, show stuff pushing along, show the status of things, show the diffs and the deltas. I did not do any of the design tools in web pages, primarily because people constantly had their browsers crashing. And it was just, they'd run into too many issues with the browser. And I still try to avoid doing tools development in web pages too, just because I find that if you do, people just get distracted, right? If they have a web browser open with your tool in it, they have another tab that's Facebook or Instagram or whatever the hell they're looking at, Reddit, and they're just constantly going through those things. It's very easy to get distracted. It's easy to accidentally close it, and it's also easy to have other problems happen in the browser or just kill the browser yourself. But usually, I don't know how many times I've seen browsers crash, and you don't want to have your data disappearing from something that you can't control. So I always build these tools in some separate standalone thing, but at the time, it was all in WinForms and very, very badly written C#. Did not know what I was doing. Didn't use any good design patterns. Didn't write anything I would want to show people today. But I think that also just shows that you can build cool things that do a lot and add a lot of value without really knowing too much about what you're doing. So I had fun with it. And if you're looking at getting into the game industry and you're not sure what kind of job to do, and maybe you've got a little bit of web or Windows programming experience, I would highly recommend looking at doing some tools development. It's a great way to transition in and to learn more about game development, learn more about what it's like on the back end, and build up those relationships and kind of some of those skills at the same time, so you can do the shift into doing like full-on game development, or when you're doing your own game development, you can build your tools along the way. That's kind of what I do now. When I build games, since I have this tooling experience in my background, I also just build tools for it, and I try to make it as easy to use, and I try to also just use my tools as much as possible so that I can see what problems I have and go in and fix them and just make stuff simple. Anyway, I'm going to quit blabbing about tools development as much as I love it. Feel like I've said all I can say about it for the day. I'll probably talk more about it later. But again, if you don't mind, just hit the like and share buttons and subscribe. I don't even think I told people to subscribe at the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe so you can see the next one when I talk about what it's like doing actual server game development, where you're building the stuff that people are playing, what that day-to-day process is like, what those meetings are like, and the kind of the turnaround and timelines on stuff, because it's quite a bit different. It's not the whole a game designer walks up and you say, okay, sure, I can do that, and you make the change, and an hour later they have their change. It's totally different, but you're still writing software. It's still a lot of fun. Anyway, thanks again. Special thanks to everybody on Patreon, and goodbye.